You're not walking on mud, you're walking on metal, on silk, on the crushed faces of men who woke up this morning believing they were invincible. The stream isn't flowing anymore, it's damned solid with bodies stacked so thick that daylight can't penetrate the water below. A warhorse thrashes in the shallows, its rider already dead beneath it, and you realize with sick clarity that you could cross from one bank to the other without ever touching ground. Just step from breastplate to breastplate, from skull to spine, across a bridge built of Europe's finest cavalry. This is impossible. This shouldn't exist. And yet, the Bannockburn runs red. Before we uncover how this nightmare became real, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm still amazed that a story from a muddy Scottish field in 1314 somehow reaches us all, no matter where we are on this planet right now. To understand how a stream becomes a graveyard, we need to go back 3 weeks. To a moment when a man made a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost 20,000 lives. That man was King Edward II of England, and in the summer of 1314, he was marching north with the most powerful military force in Western Europe. Over 2,000 heavy cavalry living tanks encased in plate armor, riding warhorses bred specifically to trample infantry into paste. Behind them, 16,000 to 20,000 foot soldiers and archers stretched across the Scottish countryside in a column 20 miles long. The baggage train alone carried enough gold, wine, and silk pavilions to outfit a coronation. Edward wasn't planning for a battle. He was planning for a victory parade. The target was Stirling Castle, the stone throat of Scotland. Whoever held it controlled the gateway between the lowlands and the highlands. It was the linchpin. And through a bureaucratic accident that would prove fatal, Edward now had a deadline. His garrison commander had made a gentleman's agreement with the Scots. If no relief force arrived by Midsummer's Day, June 24th, the castle would surrender without a fight. It was meant to be diplomatic pressure. Instead, it became a trap, because it forced Robert the Bruce, Scotland's guerrilla king, to do the one thing he'd spent 7 years avoiding: stand still and fight. Bruce was furious when he heard about the deal. His entire strategy relied on vanishing, hitting English supply lines, melting into forests, never giving them a set-piece battle. He'd survived by being smoke. Now his own brother had pinned him to a calendar and a map. If Bruce retreated, he'd lose all credibility as king. If he stayed, he'd face the most devastating cavalry charge in Christendom on ground of England's choosing. So he made a different choice. He arrived at the battlefield 3 weeks early, and he started digging. What Bruce understood, what Edward completely failed to grasp, was that wars aren't won by the biggest army. They're won by whoever controls the space where the fighting happens. Bruce walked the ground south of Stirling Castle, a hunting reserve called the New Park, and he saw something the English would never see: a kill box. The land was bordered by the Bannockburn to the east and the Pell-stream burn to the west, 2 streams cutting through marshy ground. Between them lay a narrow corridor of dry land, maybe a mile wide. If Bruce could force the English into that corridor, their numerical advantage would become a liability. They'd be crushed by their own mass. So the Scots began their real work, not prayer, not speeches. Excavation for 3 weeks. Thousands of men dug hundreds of small pits across the approach route's pots. They called them, each one about a foot wide, a foot deep, concealed with grass and sticks. Inside each pit, a sharpened wooden stake angled upward. The design was surgical. A charging warhorse weighs over a ton and hits at 20 miles per hour. If its hoof plunges into a hidden pit, the leg snaps instantly. The horse goes down. The rider, encased in 60 pounds of steel, becomes a projectile, and the riders behind him have 3 seconds to react before they crash into the wreckage. Bruce wasn't building defenses. He was building a trauma ward designed to shatter bone and create chaos, and he hid it all beneath innocent-looking grass. By June 23rd, the English vanguard arrived, young knights led by the Earls of Gloucester and Hereford. They found the Scottish army in formation, and there, riding ahead of his lines, was Robert the Bruce himself, wearing a gold circlet on his helmet, sitting on a small palfrey, completely exposed. To Henry de Bohun, this looked like a gift from God. Mounted on a war horse, he saw the king on a pony and charged. By every law of physics, Bruce should have died. But at the final instant, he sidestepped. Bohun's lance whistled past. As the massive war horse thundered by, Bruce brought his battle axe down in a perfect arc. The blade cleaved through helmet and skull. The axe handle shattered from the force. Bohun was dead before he hit the ground. The English vanguard froze. When Bruce rode back, his commanders swarmed him, furious he'd gambled Scotland's future. Bruce looked at the broken axe and said, "Only I have broken my good axe." That nonchalance was more terrifying than the kill itself. The English vanguard retreated, humiliated, to camp on the low marshy ground called the Carse of Balquhiderac. And that night, everything went wrong for them. The ground was so soft that horses sank to their fetlocks. Men couldn't lie down without soaking in cold mud. There was no room for tents. 20,000 soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, packed shoulder to shoulder in a tidal bog, drinking wine because the water was undrinkable, staring into the darkness and thinking about the man who'd just split a knight's head open with one swing. Around midnight, a Scottish knight named Alexander Seton slipped away from the English camp and rode to Bruce. Seton had been fighting for the English, but what he'd seen that day changed his mind. He knelt before Bruce and said, "If you wish to take Scotland, the time is now. The English have lost heart." Bruce listened, and then he made a decision that violated every rule of medieval warfare. The smaller army always defends. Always. But Bruce looked at his exhausted men and his hidden traps and the English army drowning in its own logistics, and he decided, at dawn, we attack. He ordered his commanders to prepare the Schiltrons. If you don't understand the Schiltron, you can't understand what happens next. It wasn't a formation. It was a weapon system. Imagine 500 men in a tight circle. The front ranks kneel, planting the butts of their pikes in the ground and angling the steel tips outward at chest height for a horse. The ranks behind them stand holding their pikes level at face height for a rider. From above, it looks like a giant hedgehog. From the front, it looks like a forest of steel moving toward you. Most pike formations in history were static. Hold the line, don't move. Bruce had trained his Schiltrons to advance while maintaining formation. They were mobile fortresses, offensive steel, and the physics were brutally simple. A horse, no matter how brave or well-trained, will not charge into a solid wall of spear points. It will shy, swerve, panic. By marching these bristling circles into the narrow English position, Bruce intended to compress the enemy army until they literally couldn't lift their arms to fight. Dawn broke on June 24, 1314. The English, stiff and cold from a sleepless night in the marsh, looked up to see something that shouldn't exist. The Scots were advancing. 3 massive Schiltrons emerged from the tree line and began marching across the open ground like slow-moving mountains of steel. King Edward II, watching from horseback, turned to his veteran commander Ingram de Umfraville and asked, bewildered, "Will yonder men fight?" At that moment, the entire Scottish army halted. Thousands of men dropped to their knees. Edward laughed. They kneel. They ask for mercy. Umfraville, who knew the Scots better, replied quietly, "They ask for mercy, sire, but not from you. They ask it of God, for these men will conquer or die." As the Scots rose and resumed their advance, the Earl of Gloucester, stung by accusations of cowardice from the night before, made a fatal decision. He didn't wait for the archers, didn't wait for infantry support. He ordered an immediate cavalry charge to prove his courage. 500 knights in full plate thundered uphill toward the Scottish lines. The sound was like an avalanche. The ground shook, horses screamed, and the Schiltrons locked into place and held. The impact sounded like a building collapsing, but it wasn't the Scots breaking. It was English cavalry shattering against an immovable object. The Earl of Gloucester was thrown from his horse and hacked to pieces instantly. Dozens of knights were impaled on the 12-foot spears. Their horses, maddened by pain, reared and thrashed, crushing their own riders and breaking the momentum of the charge behind them. And then the forest of spears did something horrifying. It started walking forward. The English infantry behind the cavalry were trapped in a bottleneck Bannockburn on one side, Pellstream Burn on the other. They couldn't move, left or right, and now a wall of steel was pushing their own cavalry backward into them. The men at the front were trying to retreat from the spears. The men at the back, unaware of the disaster, were pushing forward, eager to fight. The pressure built, ribs began to crack. Men were lifted off their feet by the density of the crowd. They weren't dying from sword strokes. They were dying from crush asphyxia, suffocating while still standing, lungs unable to expand. The Scots had engineered a human trash compactor. But where were the archers? The English longbow was the most devastating weapon of the age. At Falkirk, archers had destroyed Wallace's Schiltrons by raining arrows until the formations disintegrated. A Schiltron is a fortress against cavalry, but against arrows, it's a stationary target. Desperate, the English maneuvered Welsh archers up the Scottish left flank. If they drew their bows, the Scottish lines would collapse within minutes. The archers planted their feet, nocked their arrows, but Bruce had been at Falkirk. He'd spent 14 years preparing for this moment. Just as the first volley was about to fly, Sir Robert Keith led 500 light cavalry in a surgical strike. Archers are deadly at range, but helpless up close. Keith's cavalry hit them like a hammer striking glass. The survivors ran not away from the battle, but back into their own infantry. The English army was fighting itself. With the longbow threat eliminated, the Scottish Schiltrons were invincible. They had no natural predators left on the field. Bruce ordered his entire line to advance. The hedgehogs were hunting now. The Scots pushed forward in rhythm, shouting on them. On them they fail. The English knights, the proudest warriors in Europe, were pinned so tightly they couldn't lift their weapons. Men fainted from heat and pressure, only to be trampled into the mud. The battle had ceased to be a contest of skill. It had become a contest of volume, and the English were running out of room to exist. By mid-morning, the Scots had pushed the English back against the steep banks of the Bannockburn. Knights in heavy armor slid down into the water. Landing on top of one another, they drowned in inches of water, weighed down by steel, pinned by corpses. The stream became a dam of bodies. You could walk across it without getting your feet wet. But the final blow, the stroke that would turn this defeat into a legendary rout, came from the sky. High on Gillies Hill, a new formation appeared. To the blood-soaked English soldiers below, it looked like massive reinforcements. Thousands of fresh troops were marching over the ridge, waving banners, shouting war cries, banging weapons against shields. The English commanders looked up in despair. "They have fresh help. Run!" But here's the twist. That wasn't an army. It was the small folk, the camp followers, cooks, wagon drivers, blacksmiths, women, children. Watching their countrymen win, they'd grabbed blankets tied to poles as flags, pots and pans as drums, pitchforks and ladles as spears. They were rushing down not to fight, but to cheer and plunder. But in the heat and haze of battle, fear is a hallucinogen. The English didn't see washwomen and cooks. They saw the angel of death. The illusion was perfect. The psychological dam broke. The rear ranks of the English army, who hadn't even drawn their swords yet, turned and fled. They collided with the men behind them. The formation disintegrated into a chaotic stampede. The Scots dropped their pikes, drew swords and axes, and surged forward. What followed wasn't war. It was a massacre. Amidst the chaos, King Edward II's bodyguards grabbed the reins of his horse and dragged him away from the slaughter. Riding beside him was Sir Giles d'Argenton, considered the third best knight in all of Europe. As they broke free from the carnage, d'Argenton reined in his horse. He looked at the fleeing king, then back at the Scottish lines where his comrades were dying. He turned to Edward and said, "Sire, your reign was committed to me. You're now safely on your way. But I'm not accustomed to fleeing, nor shall I start now. I commend you to God." With those words, Sir Giles d'Argenton spurred his horse and charged back into the Scottish Schiltrons. It was a suicide run. He cut down Scots until he was pulled from his horse and killed. He chose death over dishonor. It was the last gasp of chivalry, dying in the mud. Edward rode to Stirling Castle and screamed to be let in. The constable refused. By the terms of the agreement, the castle had to surrender to the Scots, and if Edward entered, he'd become a prisoner. The King of England was rejected by his own fortress. He fled south, chased 4 miles by Sir James Douglas with only 60 horsemen, harassed and denied rest, until he finally reached a ship at Dunbar. He escaped with his life, but left behind his honor, his army, and the crown jewels. On the battlefield, the slaughter continued until sunset. The English baggage train, miles of wagons filled with gold, became Scottish property. In a single day, the poorest nation in Europe became rich. Edward II refused to recognize Bruce as king for 14 more years. But in 1320, Scottish nobles gathered at Arbroath Abbey to draft a letter to the Pope. The Declaration of Arbroath became a revolutionary manifesto. In a world of absolute monarchs, the Scots told the Pope that Bruce was their king only because he was good at the job, and if he betrayed them, they'd replace him. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we, on any conditions, be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. This sentiment traveled across centuries. Thomas Jefferson studied this text. You can hear Arbroath in the American Declaration of Independence. Finally, in 1328, Edward III signed the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton, recognizing Scotland as independent. But for Bruce, it was bittersweet. By the time peace came, he was dying, likely of leprosy. He died knowing he'd kept Scotland free. Today, if you visit the battlefield, you won't find corpses or blood. You'll find a quiet field outside the housing estates of Stirling. A massive bronze statue of Robert the Bruce stands guard-mounted, axe in hand, frozen in defiance. But the statue invites a trap. to think the Scots won because they were braver, because they had hearts of fire. That's romanticism. It does a disservice to what actually happened. The lesson of Bannockburn isn't about passion. It's about cold, hard intellect. Robert the Bruce didn't defeat Edward II by shouting louder. He defeated him by understanding the environment. He turned geography into a weapon. He used pots to neutralize horses. He used schiltrons to neutralize mass. He used camp followers to weaponize fear. It was asymmetric warfare, studied in military academies today. It teaches us that when David fights Goliath, David doesn't win by playing Goliath's game. David wins by changing the rules. The Bannockburn doesn't flow with water anymore. But if you close your eyes and listen, you can still hear the echo of 20,000 men learning that the biggest army doesn't always win. Sometimes all you need is the courage to hold your ground, the intelligence to dig a hole in the right place, and the patience to wait for the giant to step into the trap you built 3 weeks ago. The stream is quiet now, but the bodies are still there. Not in the water in the archives, the songs, the statues, the declarations of freedom written by people who remembered what it felt like when the impossible became real.